This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 189 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I have got a fun one today. It's all about unusual ways to meet the locals. I recorded interviews. In fact, I've recorded a bunch of new interviews recently because I've had so many people who are sitting around with no trips to go on, and they've all been up for a chat. So today's episode includes 3 brand new guests, which is probably the first time in ages that something like that's happened. But in any case, they all had these great stories to tell that I realized were all unusual ways to meet the locals. So, I often rave on about how meeting the locals is such a good way to be a thoughtful traveler. So many benefits from getting to know people, in your destination. And, sometimes it's hard to figure out how to do that. I've always got lots of tips, but these people today, I don't know if they're tips as such, but they are fabulous ways to be able to get to know some local people. And I thought it might inspire you to just grab any chance you can when you travel to get to know locals. So just very briefly before we get to them, thank you so much to my new Patreon supporters, and a big shout out to Judy, my first extremely thoughtful traveller supporter. If you are keen to know about the Patreon support options, just head to notaballerina.com/support. Now, my first guest today is Tracey Croke. And I'm not going to tell you how she met locals because she will in a second. But just to set the scene, she was visiting the Republic of North Macedonia for an adventure travel conference. And, she found a unique way to get to know some local people because of a certain unusual thing that was going on at the time.
Something had kicked off in the capital, Skopje. And what had happened was there'd been a bit of revolt against some government spending, and the government had bizarrely commissioned all these great and grand neoclassical statues, when there was like unemployment and other things going on. And this statue that somebody had got, priced and said should be costing about 300 grand was costing about 3 million. And And they did. So the capital of Skopje is a bit of a mix of, obviously, from when it was part of the Republic, communism, when it was part of Yugoslavia. A lot of these sort of concrete blocks had gone up. These communist era concrete blocks, and then you've got this old Turkish Ottoman, from the Ottoman times, like this old town in Turkish style. So sort of some very clashy things going on in Skopje, but it's fascinating, to see all this. And it's also the birthplace of Mother Teresa, and you can go to see the house. So there's lots going on. But the government, in their genius, decided, we need to make Skopje great again. So they got all these like statues and spent loads of money on them. And they've even got, the French Arc de Triomphe, like a copy of it, very, very...
Of course.
chintzy or kitsch, sorry. And the people had revolted. And they were going round, they would meet 6 o'clock every evening, and they'd all gather, and they'd like shoot these statues with paint guns. So these lovely statues that had spent all this money on were just covered in all these splats, But of course, the media were going, everything's going off in Skopje, and you had police in the riot gear and tanks there and everything. I'm like, what am I dropping into now? And I was going to an adventure conference there because Macedonia is an absolutely untapped gem in my view after being there, and seeing, and it's what the adventure world would regard as like the adventure next, a kind of an area that's really ripe for adventure and has got lots going on in terms of offers, and tourism infrastructure is there and it's all ready to go. But people at that time hadn't quite I suppose, really sort of discovered it. So there was things like, you can go and join the bear rangers and go on a conservation week trekking with them. You can obviously do all the mountain biking and hiking in 3 national parks. It's got sort of world heritage centres that sit together, just like in Queensland, not the Barrier Reef and the Daintree, obviously, but it's got Lake Orchard, which is a natural site, and then the town of Orchard, which is the heritage site, and lots of history and stuff going on, and the food's amazing, and everybody seems to just go and get stuff from the garden and cook, and in the restaurants you get this like fabulous mix of Middle East and Mediterranean food, and all that, like I discovered afterwards. But I got there, and it was the people were just unhappy with this stand. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity to get to know the locals, because the best way to find about a country is to get close to the locals, and that's why I love bike travel so much, because people are always curious why you're on a bike, so you get to have these really cool conversations. So I was thinking to myself, okay, so I was on my own in this journey, so I'll just gather, I'll go at 6 o'clock and we'll all just have a look what's happening. And 6 o'clock came, and it was like crickets. There was nothing happening at all. So I went and I rang a guy there I know who's an agent, and was going to the conference. And I said, "What's happening?" He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "they've all gone to Greece. It's Easter. We don't have revolutions in in holiday time." And I went, "Oh right, okay, the revolution's been postponed. I understand." Yeah. So I went off around Macedonia, and then I came back, and I was just writing up my stories in the capital before I flew out, and I just kind of heard, a bit of a commotion, or not commotion, but gathering of people. So I went, this was this great march that they did every night, from, splattering the statues to marching out to the government buildings with the banners and protesting. And I think it did result actually in certain ministers resigning as well. But, in that march, you just chat. It's just, again, just very ordinary people, nothing angsty going on. It was a very peaceful march. There was couples holding hands. There were students, there were families, and they were just protesting against what they thought was a spend of money. So and I got to have some great conversations and go and have a beer with them later. So
awesome.
Yeah. Join a revolution.
I know I'm all for meeting the locals, but I've never actually recommended meet the locals by joining their protests. But in this case, it seems like it was a good decision.
It was a very peaceful protest. Yeah,
I know. I love the paint splattering protest idea. is a lovely one. So
I've still got those pictures. I mean, I'm sure that the strange thing is, it became such a thing that, to the horror, or to the, I don't know, I suppose, disappointment of the people that were marching against this, it did become a tourist attraction in its own right. So these neoclassical buildings and great, statues of Alexander the Great, and and they are. You sort of have lions, but it's a lot of random stuff that's not really explained as well. And I'm sure they washed the paint off now.
So there you go. As Tracey pitched that story to me, you can meet the locals by joining a revolution. Do be careful about joining any protests, of course. I usually advise against it. But in this case, Tracey had obviously done some due diligence and figured out that this protest was a safe one to get involved with. And nothing better than being able to get to know some locals and even have a beer with them and a good chat. Great way to do it. Now, my next guest today is JoAnna Haugen. She's currently living in Kiev in Ukraine, and as part of her time there, she discovered that you could become, quite easily in fact, an international observer of an election, and which is something, you hear about all the time. There are international observers. I never thought about how to become one, but you just ask around, basically. In Ukraine for the recent presidential election, she said there were about 300 different kind of groups or committees that included observers, and you could volunteer to be involved. And so she the first round of the election was allocated to observe in a town. She said it was about 9 or 10 hours by train south of Kiev, very Soviet town. And this is her experience.
I observed the first round of the elections with a Ukrainian-American woman who lives in Connecticut, and she flew back to observe because she has American citizenship now. She was able to observe. And we spent the day, we essentially had like a little pocket of the town, and our job was to go from site to site to site, wherever we wanted to go within our pocket. And there are a list of questions that you have through your organization just to make sure that the election is being run in a fair and transparent manner.
Right.
And it was a very eye-opening experience to me. There were several things about the election. Of course, I was coming into this with an American mindset. So normally American elections are held on Tuesdays. And where I most recently was a voter, I was in Nevada, and the machines were electronic, and it was kind of like a computer setup. So, in a long line, and I was coming at this with this American mindset of what it's like to vote and how it can be kind of difficult sometimes. And I was impressed with so many things that I observed during our day of observation. So just to give you a few examples, the election is held on a Sunday so that everybody has the opportunity to vote because, people aren't at work.
Right.
The election sites are all within very close walking distance where people live. I think, if I recall correctly, a site couldn't have more than 2,000 people registered.
Oh,
so
wow.
that meant that if there was an apartment complex, there might be like a school or a small building nearby. And in it, there might be like 4 different election spots to accommodate all of those people who are voting in this one place.
Wow.
So, you don't have these super long lines, because there are enough voting places for everybody.
Right.
If you aren't able to make it down to vote, they have what are called mobile voting boxes, and you have to let people who need a mobile voting boxes. So for example, they had mobility issues or they were ill or something like this. They had to let their place of voting know, I believe it was 48 hours in advance. And they actually would take this clear box with somebody who was one of the 15 people running an election site. They went with a security person, as many observation people that wanted to go, and they would walk the box up to the person's apartment so that they could cast a vote and have their voice heard. We observed voting in a hospital. There also you can also vote in prisons. So everybody who basically, if you're a Ukrainian citizen, you have the right to vote. And it is done by just it's a long sheet of paper. There were like 55 candidates for the first round, and so there's this massive sheet of paper, and everybody just you got your sheet of paper. You made an X in the box you wanted to, for the candidate you wanted, folded it up, and just put it in a giant clear container in the middle of the room so everybody could see, the box was not hidden, not being
tampered with. Yeah, right.
Yep.
Awesome.
And then at the end of the night, after observing, 15 different sites or something, just making sure that they were accessible and things along this line. At the end of the night, we chose one of the polling spots, and stayed for the counting. And essentially, they unlock the box. So they cut the seals around the side, dump the ballots onto a table, and one by one, they, read the names of each of the people who has gotten a vote, they make piles, they count the piles, they fill out the final official form, and then it goes into a special sealed envelope, which is then, sent to the regional office where the numbers are tabulated. And as an observer, you can follow that whole process if you want. You can get in a car, you can follow that piece of paper all the way to the end if you want to make sure that the votes are calculated. So, the first election, it was something like almost 70% of people voted, something very similar for our second election, which I observed here in Kiev.
Right.
And it was just, it was a very insightful experience, very interesting experience. I as now a registered voter in the state of Wisconsin, I have struggled to vote, being somebody who's voting from abroad. And I'm very appreciative of the process I saw as an international observer. It was a very interesting cultural experience to have.
Yes, that's what I keep thinking as you tell me this story. Like, what a fascinating way to dig deeper into a local culture. It's brilliant. Like, you always hear on the news that, there are, international election observers in place, blah, blah, blah. But it never occurred to me to really think about where those people come from and what they do or anything like that. So what a fabulous experience. I think that's brilliant. Yeah.
It's something that, like I said, a lot of countries have election observers. So if you're headed to a country prior to an election, it's worth looking into any nonprofit organizations that might be looking for observers, or any associations. Like I volunteered with the Ukrainian American Association or something like that. It's a just a association for Ukrainian Americans that has a contingency here and then offices in the U.S. And organizations like this are always looking for observers. It's a very interesting and definitely interesting way to learn about a place.
So how cool is that? They got to chat to all these local people when they were leaving polling booths to ask about their experiences and checking up on how things went, and also just the cultural differences of learning so much about how a country runs its elections. I thought that was just such a fascinating way to get to know a place a whole lot better. Now, my final guest today is Jen Williams, and she had a really fun experience because she got chatting to some local people regularly when she was visiting Bagan in Myanmar.
Myanmar is such a wonderful place, and it's one of the most wonderful places to meet locals because they are so friendly, and it's not as over touristy populated as other places. So they're still growing into their tourism, and that makes them very friendly and very, curious and wanting to talk to you and that. So I find that really refreshing. I had already gone through a lot of Myanmar, and I was in Bagan at this point when I met this couple, and I was staying in a hostel, and across from the hostel is an e-bike rental place. So the best things to do in Bagan is to rent an e-bike so you can tour around all the pagodas, because there's something like 2,000 pagodas over there.
Right.
And so you just get on the e-bike and you go for the day. And I would rent the e-bikes from them every day, and we would just strike up conversations. And one of the girls that I was traveling with at that time, we would see signs for palm reading and different stuff like that. And we're like, oh, that would be really cool to do. And so we asked the people that were renting all the mopeds, and we're like, oh, where can we get this done? And they're like, oh, well, they're all done, in the local language. No one does it in English. I'm like, that's too bad. He's like, well, actually, there is a shaman that's really, really popular here. And, I can see if I can get you in. And I'm like, yes, please.
Cool.
And so he came back, a day later, and was like, okay, well, I can get you in. I will come with you and translate everything.
Awesome.
I was like, oh my God, that would be great. And he's like, okay. my friend unfortunately couldn't get in because she was leaving for another tour in a couple of days. And so I was still going to be there. So I was like, okay, well, I still want to go. So I arrived at this, meeting place, and it was in a tiny little village, and he's up on this stilt house, and it was, you basically waited outside there, and people were just looking at me because I was the only white person around.
Right.
And I was like, okay, just wave. I wave and I smile a lot to people.
That's a good strategy.
Yeah. So someone came over and she spoke English, and she was actually the granddaughter of the shaman. And so she was talking to me, and I was telling her, oh, I'm waiting for someone to come over, and he's going to translate everything for me. She's like, oh, okay. And so he arrived, and we were waiting, and there was already some people in the little hut. And so we just sat in the corner in the back, and they're all locals, like all serious locals, and they go all the time. And so they just seeing someone that is not a local was like, what the heck is she doing here? And so I was like, hi. And so they were all very curious about me, asking me questions. And the shaman it was like something I've never seen before. When it was my turn, he goes up and he asks you if you have any questions, and what I want to know about. And so I just, tell me about what's coming up in my life. And the way that he reads your, basically your future is he has all these old, wristwatches.
Oh,
so it's all different types of wristwatches that he has all face down. And then he says something in the language or whatever. And then he flips over the wristwatch and goes and tells you what it says. I'm like,
oh, how intriguing. I've never heard of such a thing.
I know, right? Like, how does that happen? So basically he told me about my future, that I should, definitely pursue, the avenues that I am thinking about, business-wise and relationship-wise, and that I should wait for a different relationship. Like, just giving me all that juicy stuff that we all want to know. But it was just so I've never seen using wristwatches.
No,
and
it can't be a traditional method then, because what did they do before wristwatches?
Right. And then you were like, okay, well, then it was like, if you want all of this stuff to come true, you got to do this. And this is you have to do it's almost like a ritual, offering to the gods. And you had to bring this fruit and these flowers and everything else. I'm like, well, if the gods want it, we're going to do the fruit and the flowers.
I want a good future.
I know, right? So I went to go get the fruit and the flowers. And so that was a cool experience. And not only did the guy that was the owner of the e-bike place tell me about the shaman and take me to the shaman, but he also knew that I was going to be leaving and I love to take photos. And he told me that I should stay for this pagoda festival. And I was like, oh, well, what's that? And he was telling me about it. He's like, you'll want to take photos of it. It's all the monks show up and they get all their offerings and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, that sounds really cool. So I extended my trip and I went, one thing that you really need to do is when you do talk to locals is really become friends with them. Like, don't just do the surface stuff, because then they start telling you stuff that you should know. Because the night before this whole Bagan festival was part of the festival is a whole concert. It's a huge concert, outdoor concert and everything like that. And I was like, oh, some of the people from the hostel want to go. I want to go. So I was asking him about it. He's like, don't go. I was like, well, why not? And he's like, nope, they're really dangerous. And he's like, to get there, you have to take a taxi. And he's like, the roads are so incredibly dangerous. You don't want to go driving yourself. And basically what happens is everyone drinks. So everyone is drunk. So everyone is drinking and driving. And so there's tons of accidents. And then he's like, plus at the festival itself, at the music festival, there's usually always something that happens, either fights or something along the other lines. So apparently there was a stabbing that night over there, as well. So just to know these little things, so you're not just kind of caught in the crossfires of anything else. And so I know people that did go and they had a fine time, but
Yeah, sometimes it's better to take only
I'm not going to understand anyways.
Yep, definitely. Yep.
Yeah. So, but the next morning they told me exactly where to go, how to get there, and what time I should arrive. I got there before sunrise, and it was some of the best photos I've taken. It was mostly all locals. There was only a handful of tourists there, and just taking photos. When I got there, I walked through, and you just see the tables and tables and tables of offerings that the locals bring for the monks.
Right.
And what happens is the monks line up outside of the temple, and then they all get a ticket, and then they redeem their ticket once they go through into the temple, and they're given a bag of kind of the necessities, and then they're given one of the baskets of what the offerings that people bring in.
Right.
And so just taking pictures of standing around, plus there's like ice cream guys, selling ice cream cones to, all the monks and stuff like that. And it was just one of those magical morning moments where the sun rays just come through like the trees, just absolutely gorgeous. And if I didn't talk to the locals, I would have never known about it.
Exactly.
And I would have missed that whole opportunity.
Jen told me that since that trip, some of the especially positive things that the shaman had predicted about her future have come true. So that was an extra bonus, and what a fun way to experience Bagan that only came about because she'd really got chatting to some local people. Perfect, I think. And I hope that these fun tales inspire you to reach out and find different ways to connect with locals when you travel. I think it is without doubt always rewarding in all different kinds of ways, and you have a great story to tell as well. It's a perfect situation. So thank you very much for listening to episode 189 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Big shout out to my fabulous guests. So first of all, I chatted with Tracey Croke. She's a travel journalist and also has a site with some great writing and photography and videos. So if you head to traceycroke.com, you can find that there. Croke is C-R-O-K-E. She said to me that lots of people think it's croak like the frog spelling, which actually never occurred to me, but apparently I'm not common like that. Secondly, I chatted with JoAnna Haugen. JoAnna is the founder of Rooted, which is a storytelling platform covering sustainable travel and more. It's really awesome. So you can find her at joannahaugen.com/rooted. And last, I chatted with Jen Williams of Launch Your Travels, and her site is at launchyourtravels.com. Don't forget, you can support the Thoughtful Travel podcast by becoming a very thoughtful traveller or an extremely thoughtful traveller. There's bonus content and a few other benefits there. And of course, my eternal gratitude. And you can find details about that at notaballerina.com/support. Also, come along and chat with us in the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. We are closing in on 1,000 people there. And I would really like to hit that 1,000 mark soon because, I don't know, it seems like a good milestone. So please come along and join us and invite your friends. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook or find the link in the show notes. For this episode, the show notes are at notaballerina.com/189. As always, thank you really so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.